Hello students, this week we are going to talk about the menstrual cycle. I want to start with kind of breaking down some walls since this is a bit of a taboo topic, even in our modern culture where we understand the biological relevance of a menstrual cycle in a fertile woman. If you want to follow this link, menstruating women are cursed. This dates back to ancient times where, a woman who was menstruating and bleeding, this really freaked people out, and they created all of these kind of weird myths. So like if a menstruating woman was trying to straighten her hair, it would go curly, the mayonnaise would spoil, they're unfit for cooking and these sorts of things because the food would go off, and also that women are unfit for coitus at this time. All of these things are completely untrue. While you likely won't get pregnant if you engage in coitus during your menstrual phase of your menstrual cycle, there still is no medical reason why you can't engage in that. There is no reason why you can't cook a delicious dish or style your hair however you want. But we kind of poke fun at these myths. And even though we likely don't believe them and laugh at them, if we understand a little bit of science, these modern menstrual products play into these outdated taboos. Look at these tampon ads. They're really bragging about how small those tampons are, how you can really hide them, in your pocket behind your back, because no one should ever know if you're menstruating. And again, it's kind of a silly thing. So we need to let some of those ideas go and talk about the science behind it. Okay, so the human menstrual cycle is regulated by the hypothalamic pituitary gonad axis. We're going to study kind of the finer points of that, and we'll see that it's a little bit more of a complex interplay than what goes on a daily basis in the male system. So human menstrual cycle spans 1 calendar month. This comes from the term menses, right, which means month. And the uterine and ovarian cycle combined are generally about 28 days. So this is also usually tied to the lunar calendar, again, kind of feeding into some of this folklore and intrigue about the menstrual cycle. Truth be told, not all women hit that exact 28-day cycle. Most of us fit within a range of somewhere between 25 and 30 days. And we'll find out where the variation is in that. It's usually in something that's associated more with the ovary, the follicular phase, or getting the follicles ready. We'll find that the luteal phase is often very spot on and very regular from woman to woman. So let's take a look here. Okay, so we can really break apart a menstrual cycle into what's going on at the level of the ovary and what's going on at the level of the uterus. And those are often tied and matched up because it's really important. If the ovary is going to go through the trouble of maturing a follicle into a nice ripe ovulated egg, we need to have the uterus ready to receive and implant that egg so we can forward pregnancy. So we will find, if we first just look at what's going on in the ovarian cycle, there are 3 main phases. So we first have our early follicular phase, where we are selecting a cohort of new follicles to mature. That usually lasts about 5 days. Then we'll move on to a late follicular phase, where we're selecting some of those follicles are getting a little bit bigger. Some of the ones that aren't so good are going to become atretic, meaning they're going to die. And then after that, about halfway through the cycle at day 14, we move from follicular phase into luteal phase. So that's the cycle that happens in the ovary that is, again, about 28 days. Okay. If you're wondering where the variation is, again, from woman to woman, if you have a longer or shorter cycle, it's probably your follicular phase that's a little different. Luteal phase is usually spot on 14 days. Okay, if we're looking at what the uterus is doing, what the uterus is doing is often more obvious to us because the uterine lining is building up every month, okay? And then that lining is shed if pregnancy doesn't occur. And that shedding of that uterine lining is the menstrual phase. So that's why we start that with day 1, because that is an obvious sign whenever menstrual fluid is leaving the body, and that's perceived as your period, right? So the menstrual phase lasts 5 to 7 days. And then after that uterine lining is shed, then we just start anew. So then after the menses ends, we'll enter what's called a proliferative phase. Cell proliferation is just when cells are dividing and growing. So that uterine lining is actually growing and becoming thicker and resetting. Then right about at day 14, what happens is that uterine lining is going to then enter what's called a secretory phase. So it's about as thick as it's going to get, but we're going to start putting in glands and really adjusting the blood vessels and things like that so that it becomes a perfect place for an ovulated egg to implant. We can take these two things and combine them together because if we want to have a hope of getting pregnant, we do really need to match up our ovarian and uterine cycles. And if we blend them together, we generally we borrow terms from both of these cycles. So the menstrual phase, again, becomes the first part of that combined menstrual cycle. And then we call the next part the follicular phase as the follicles are really finishing to ripen up. And then we call the last part of that, those last 14 days, we're going to call that the luteal phase. Okay, let's take a look at this a little bit differently. Do not be intimidated by this figure. We're going to break it down. So what we've done here is instead of looking at a circular timeline, we have simply just stretched this timeline right out and flattened it out for 28 days. Okay, so let's introduce a little bit of this. So again, if we wanted to look at the ovarian cycle, again, we can see those first couple of days where we have early follicular phase, moving on to later follicular phase. Again, day 14 is really critical because that's generally when ovulation happens. And then we're moving into luteal phase, where we're going to actually form something called the corpus luteum. So that's where it gets its name. Okay, so the ovarian cycle phases are named very much so whether you have a follicle that's developing or whether you have a corpus luteum that has appeared post-ovulation. If we look at this portion of the figure, this is showing the relative thickness of the uterine lining. So again, those first few days, we're going to call those menses, and we can see that there is destruction here, right? This lining is sloughing off and becoming thinner and thinner, and then the uterine lining is absolutely at its thinnest, okay, as we are trying to build up our follicles. We're going to start here at about day 5 or 7 and start to build up and proliferate in our uterus. So proliferative phase just means, again, mitosis is happening and cells are growing. So this is getting thicker and thicker and thicker. And then again, when we're about at our thickest at day 14, what we're going to do is now again go into a secretory phase. So we'll see more blood vessels and more glands really growing in here. Okay. Because we have to think about the timing here. Whenever the egg is ovulated, it will take about 7 days for that egg to work its way through the female reproductive tract. So we want to be able to implant in the uterus, right, whenever it's nice and thick and has its good store of glands. So this is if you were going to get pregnant, right? It's typically happening right around day 21. Okay, I've ignored the hormones on here. We do have some players that we are familiar with. So gonadotropin releasing hormone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone. And then we also have some ovarian hormones on here, estrogens, inhibin, and progesterone. And then the last thing that we have to integrate into this figure is body temperature. And we will see that something interesting happens around day 14. So we'll come back to this. I want to break this figure up into a discrete timeline so it's a little bit easier to digest. I would say if you're studying and you can recreate this figure or explain it to someone else, then you have the menstrual cycle down and you are good to go for the exam. Let's practice with it a little bit more. Okay, so what I've done here is just clipped this figure and cropped it into just really the menstrual phase of the uterine cycle and that early follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. So let's narrate a little bit more what's going on. Again, we are losing our uterine lining. Specifically, we're just losing the functional zone. We always have to keep that basal layer so that there is something to grow from. The way that this happens is the spiral arteries that are contained right in our uterine lining. So here's a section of uterine lining here. Basically just this little bit here, magnified into this zoomed in view here. So the spiral arteries are named because they are coiled arteries, and they will spasm whenever it's time for menses to start. The blood flow will be interrupted. This will cause ischemia in the tissues, basically a lack of blood flow. When we don't have blood flow to a tissue, the tissue will die. The endometrial functional zone is that tissue that is dying. So it will die, and we say that it is sloughed off, and bit by bit it will start to be released right through the cervix into the vagina, right, and then that's perceived as the menstrual period. So it's actually not blood, it's little bits of tissue that are dying, but people tend to call it blood. So the amount of tissue loss that we're having here is about 1 to 8 ounces across a menstrual cycle, and that's normal and typical. If you're having more fluid loss than that, you might need to see a doctor. You might become what's called anemic, and you might have problems, really carrying oxygen in your body and maintaining daily function. So you might need to take an iron supplement to help build some more red blood cells if you are losing too much tissue and blood through your regular menses. Okay, and then again, what's going on at the level of the ovary? It needs to reset from the prior menstrual cycle. So if there was a corpus albicans, the white body that is the little leftover from the follicle from the prior month, that's going to regress and get out of the way. If it doesn't regress and get out of the way, you're probably going to be someone that has polycystic ovary disease if those old follicles are hanging around and not shrinking up into their corpus albicans form. Okay, so at this point, the ovary, again, because the follicular cycle that we go through, it really takes like multiple months to mature follicles. We are going to be at the point where we'll pick a new cohort to start going up, but the cohort that's ready to roll is in its tertiary follicle status, or Graafian follicle if you have an older textbook. Some of the follicles are not going to make it. They're going to become atretic and die. So we're getting down to our last handful of tertiary follicles, and it's going to be in the coming days that we pick our favorite and best tertiary follicle. And if we look at our hormones, both the brain hormones from the hypothalamus and the pituitary and our ovarian hormones are relatively low. So we see most of these are flatlined here. This is a very low hormone time of the cycle. Everything's resetting. All right, now I have the next sliver of the figure here, and this is where some of the action is going to happen. So what happens in the ovary is those good tertiary follicles are really going to rapidly grow. This is, again, our late follicular phase if we're just describing what's in the ovary. And really, again, when people combine to the menstrual cycle, they're describing this as the follicular phase, because it's all about which follicle is going to grow to be the biggest and the best. By day 13, we should only have one good follicle. If we have two, then yay, it's twins. But we should only have one good follicle at this point, and the other ones will undergo atresia. And what we find out is that really big, good follicle has lots of granulosa cells, so it is just pumping out estrogen. So estrogen is the red in this image here, and we can see estrogen really coming up and increasing in concentration until we get to about day 13, 14. So it's really up there. What's going to happen to the uterus? Remember, we now have to match what's going on at the level of the ovary, so the uterus will be able to receive that ovulated egg when it's going to arrive there, if it should arrive there. It's a very optimistic organ. It's planning on pregnancy every month. So again, we look here and we can see our uterine lining is thickening. We need to be vascularized, so we'll get fresh spiral arteries that'll grow. And what we find out, again, because there is kind of a multiple mechanisms here with the hypothalamic pituitary gonad axis, we see that something a little bit strange happens at day 14. Let's look at this. Okay, so normally, right, when we talk about a negative feedback loop and what we talked about in the male system and on a regular day, you get your GnRH pulse, you get a pulse of luteinizing hormone, and you get a pulse of follicle stimulating hormone. And then that's going to get the ovary to create some estrogens and progesterones. And then as we have a high enough amount of estrogen, that's going to negatively feed back and generally should shut down the hypothalamic pituitary gonad axis. And then you'll go through a pulse the next day. When we get to day 14, things become a little bit weird. Instead of negative feedback, we get positive feed forward really going on here. So we have to think about there being kind of a continuum of estrogen. So let's say if we have like low estrogen to like medium estrogen, let's just draw an estrogen continuum here. So let's say we have high estrogen on the end of this. Okay, so if we have like low to medium estrogen, the hypothalamic pituitary gonad axis will have negative feedback, as we often describe. If we get to this threshold where we have a giant follicle that is pumping out lots of estrogen, then, you know, once we go beyond this, we get a new pattern here. So instead of the receptors in the hypothalamus shutting down and stopping GnRH production, there becomes a threshold where the receptors are now going to do the opposite. Very, very high estrogen levels are going to enhance GnRH release. So it's opposite day on day 14. That's going to trigger a big old luteinizing hormone surge, much more than the average day. And the big old luteinizing hormone surge is going to induce ovulation. Okay, and that's really what's going to get our follicle, right, to rupture. We see the follicle that is very big, the one that was just pumping out estrogen, has lined itself up with the edge of the ovarian wall and the cortex, and it gives a little squeeze, and the pressure in the fluid-filled follicle will build up, and pop out goes the egg there. So this is a really specific and special case to trigger ovulation. Again, going back to our figure, right? We were watching our estrogen go up in our follicle. Ta-da, here it is. And then whenever it gets high enough, right, we're going to go back up to the top here. The green line is the gonadotropin releasing hormone. Again, we have, all right, a couple pulses per day and we reset with negative feedback, but ta-da, at day 14, we get a big old pulse followed by our luteinizing hormone surge. Look how big that surge is. And we get a little blip in the follicle stimulating hormone. But what I'm going to ask you and what you need to be prepared for is it really is the luteinizing hormone surge that is making this happen, ovulation. So what is going to happen post-ovulation, and now that that egg is released and freely floating through the female reproductive tract, we now have a 7-day clock on this. It's going to be 7 days before that egg is going to get to the uterus. Hopefully that egg will get fertilized, or at least that's what the uterus is hoping and getting ready for. So that endometrium needs to become thick and it needs to become spongy. Again, we've got a 7-day transit time for that egg. So that's our 7-day clock. Get thick, uterus. That is the secretory phase. What's going on at the level of the ovary? Right, whenever that egg ovulates, it's going to be released with a couple of granulosa cells. It's got a little cloud that it takes with it, but it can't take all of its follicle with it. It's got to leave behind some of that within the ovary. So that becomes the basis for the corpus luteum. This is the leftover shell of the follicle. And what it will do is it will start to luteinize. And it's mostly those theca cells that are really going to start pumping out high levels of progesterone. So we can see we had the estrogen peak whenever we were coming to the end of follicular phase. And now we have a big progesterone peak with a bit of kind of a smaller estrogen echo and a little bit of an inhibin echo here, where again, the follicle is leftover follicle that is the corpus luteum. That's what's pumping out these hormones. And the progesterone is really going to target the uterus. That's where the receptors are. And the uterus is, again, trying to get nice and thick and ready for implantation. So what if you personally would like to family plan and you're not interested in getting pregnant? One of your options is to take a hormonal contraceptive. So you can either take a pill, or perhaps you have an intrauterine device, or something that is giving you a low dose of hormones. What basically goes on here is if we keep everything kind of at an even keel and never get big estrogen buildups or big progesterone buildups, then what's going to happen is we won't be able to ovulate. So that's really the basis of how hormonal birth control works. If you're taking an estrogen or progesterone pill every day, that's going to keep you nice and even. We never get that really special day 14 moment where GnRH pulse is through the roof and our luteinizing hormone surges. Okay, and then again, we had about a 7-day window. So if you were going to get pregnant, the egg would need to be arriving here on day 21. And if that doesn't happen, if the egg just sails through and leaves the body unfertilized and unimplanted, then what's going to happen is the body will get ready for menses. So the corpus luteum will start to degrade. It's going to go from the yellow body to the white body, the corpus albicans, and then what will happen there is we get ready for a new menstrual cycle. So these hormone levels start to drop as the corpus albicans begins to degrade, and we shall start anew. All right, I would take a minute and go back to that original figure. That. And again, if you can break it down and talk your way through it the way that I did, I think you're going to be in very good shape for the exam. Take it bit by bit. It is a scary figure. So I already mentioned that we could have some variation, right? Textbook often describes a 28-day cycle, and we know that there are variations. So again, that luteal phase is typically spot on from woman to woman. And that is generally a 14-day window. That's tightly regulated. Where we often have variation is some women have a little bit longer or shorter menstrual phase, but then the follicular phase is usually what is widely varying. Depends on how much estrogen your follicles are producing. If you've got little follicles or something's going on, and maybe you are undernourished, hey, something's going on there, it might take a little bit longer for your follicles to get to that point where they trigger the GnRH pulse. If you are someone that is trying to family plan to either have a baby or not have a baby, there are other cues that you can look for. Mittelschmerz. This is a German word that is referring to the pain that you feel from the follicle rupture. It is a very subtle pain, and I would say likely most women don't perceive it. I don't hear a lot of people walking around going, ouch, I just ovulated. Perhaps though, if you are someone that is really in tune with your body and you have more pain receptors than the average person, maybe you will experience that Mittelschmerz. What is more telling and what people often do is track body temperature. So if we go back to the big figure, right, this is why body temperature was on the bottom panel. You do get a slight increase in body temperature right after ovulation occurs. So that's often a good indicator that if your body temperature just went up, you have just ovulated, it's a great time to have sexual intercourse if your goal is pregnancy. If it's not, you perhaps want to avoid or use a contraceptive method. The other thing, our uterus will give us a clue in terms of cervical mucus. So what we'll find is the cervical mucus is often very thick, and it's so thick that it doesn't even allow sperm cells to swim through it on a given day. But whenever we get close to ovulation and we want pregnancy to occur, that cervical mucus will need to thin down to allow for sperm cells to swim. So usually the female reproductive tract just is saying, no, we can't get pregnant today, there's no point, so nice thick mucus. So you can actually assess your cervical mucus by taking a little bit of a sample in your own fingers, and if you put your thumb and forefinger together and the mucus strand breaks, you have thick mucus, and likely it's not good for sperm to swim through and you will not get pregnant. But if you have just ovulated or are around that day and you're cervical mucus is thinning down. This is indicating that sperm are going to be able to swim through and pregnancy is a possibility. So you just, again, put your thumb and forefinger together, and if this makes kind of a thinner string like that, okay, so maybe like more like saliva versus really thick snot, okay, then that's really what is going to give you a clue that you might be near ovulation. If you are someone that is having trouble and you really do want to have a baby, you can certainly go to a physician, and then they'll start testing your luteinizing hormone levels and follicle stimulating hormone levels as well. Okay, PMS. First of all, this is something too that gets a lot of hard knocks, and just people mumble about it and are like, oh, premenstrual syndrome, PMS. And people usually talk about it and use it completely wrong. Premenstrual syndrome implies that it occurs prior to menstruation. So whenever you hear some uninformed man grumbling that, oh, this woman, she's in a mood, she must be on her period. False. She is likely 3 to 10 days before her period. Okay. And again, it is a very real syndrome, and some people are afflicted more than others. And it can come on, you know, at different times throughout the lifetime. Obviously, someone that is in puberty, your hormones are going to be raging on a very different pattern than someone that is maybe later in their life cycle versus someone that is approaching menopause. So 70 to 90% of women experience some type of symptom, but by no means do they experience all of these symptoms. And again, some people are more severe and may want to seek medical treatment. So physically, you'll start to feel cramping as those spiral arteries start to spasm and die, and that's going to start to kill the blood flow again to the functional zone of your uterus. So as tissue is dying in your body, that's going to start to hurt. The uterus will start to contract a little bit, again, to help shake loose some of those layers. You may experience fatigue, breast tenderness, fluid retention, weight gain, acne, and migraine headache is often associated with this. Cause, the thought is the withdrawal of the high estrogen and the progesterone. Things like migraine headache are really poorly understood. And again, it is really rough coming off of like a high dose and then withdrawing into these lower doses of hormones. So some people really have great success taking a progesterone only pill or perhaps a progesterone replacement pill as part of either their birth control regimen or just specifically for the premenstrual syndrome. GnRH blockers, that'll certainly knock the whole axis down, but then you're basically putting yourself into kind of a menopause state. This can be reversed if you have functional ovaries, if you're interested in family planning, but again, those side effects are likely unpleasant. Some people have been prescribed an antidepressant during the luteal phase. So as you're anticipating, right, moving into that luteal phase, and before you enter your menses phase, taking that for a couple of days sometimes helps people. You absolutely have to consult your doctor. And of course, a healthy lifestyle, getting enough sleep, eating right, and getting some exercise can usually reduce these symptoms. I remember anecdotally speaking to my mother, and she often said that she was excused from gym class when she was a girl if she told the gym teacher that she was premenstrual or in menses, and that is just the worst advice ever. This is something that you want to keep exercising through, not if you have a splitting migraine headache, of course, but again, maintaining your regular physical activity and your regular diet are going to be the most beneficial things in combating some of these unpleasant symptoms. Okay, and then there can be some other menstrual variations. So we already talked about there being, you know, the cramping, obviously, again, losing that layer of uterine lining, right, because some of that tissue is dying, that sometimes can result in pain. right? Dysmenorrhea, anything that is this or that, like dysfunctional, right? This is indicating that something is a bit wrong here. So a lot of people, in addition to getting premenstrual cramps, will get menstrual cramps. Again, that uterine lining is trying to shake loose the dead layer. Okay. This is driven by a prostaglandin process, something that was clearly named for the prostate gland, right? The prostaglandins, but we also, again, knowing how similar our structures once were in male and female, we are aware that prostaglandins are in women too, and again, they are functioning mostly in the uterus. And prostaglandins can be inhibited by simply taking a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, like an aspirin or an ibuprofen. So that is often why when someone says, oh, I have menstrual cramps, you are offered an aspirin or an ibuprofen to take care of that. That's going to inhibit the prostaglandins from working, and that's going to inhibit these pain signals and inflammation. Okay, so some variations. Amenorrhea, so A in front of anything means like a lack thereof, or something's not happening here. So if you are amenorrheic, that means you are skipping or missing some of your menstrual cycles. There is primary and secondary. So no menstrual cycle by age 15 indicates that that there might be something wrong with puberty and development there. There is a continuum for puberty. 15 is really pushing it to the late end if you haven't at least had one menstrual cycle. Secondary is going several months without a cycle. And the most obvious reason for this is, surprise, you're pregnant. Okay, because you're going to start keeping that uterine lining and growing it into a placenta and things to nourish that baby. So if you go 3 to 6 months without a cycle, I would recommend a pregnancy test. If you are approaching late 40s, early 50s, you might want to consult your doctor. Perhaps you are perimenopausal. Or if you are in your reproductively fertile years, perhaps you are not eating enough food and you are exercising too much. So really commonly, people that are marathon runners, or this person's a ballet dancer, a lot of women that are in these really physically demanding sports where you are maintaining a low body mass, what's going on here is basically you are out of energy balance. So you simply need to eat a little bit more food because your body is trying to survive, it's trying to grow, and then if it were also trying to reproduce, that is a third place that we need to divert nutrients and energy to. So the reproductive system is the first thing we start to shut down if we're not eating enough food on a daily basis. This is called the female athlete triad. This common symptom, and again, sometimes younger women with eating disorders will eat less and less because they're trying not to gain weight, or they're trying to attain some sort of body look. That is really dangerous, and the best thing to do is just to start eating a little bit more. You won't gain weight, I promise you this. You won't gain weight, you'll just regain your menses if you've gotten yourself that far out of energy balance. There is the Women's Health and Exercise Lab, WHEL. There's a lab on Penn State's campus in the Knoll Research Center that studies this. So that's those were my neighbors. I knew a good bit about that when I was getting my PhD. Okay, oligomenorrhea. Oligo means few, so you're skipping cycles. So you're not going like a big 3 to 6 month chunk. You are probably battling some type of infertility issue. So maybe you have polycystic ovary syndrome, and you probably have very long follicular phases, or there's something going on, you know, those follicles after ovulation and rupture, they're not turning into a proper corpus luteum and degrading. So something's going on there. That's something you definitely want to go to the doctor. Again, maintaining healthy diet and exercise and staying in energy balance is good. If you are flirting with that, female athlete triad where you're exercising a lot but not eating a lot, that could be the case. All right, and then finally, why do women menstruate? So I have the original article from the Jones and Lopez text posted so you can go through it, but it is a little bit curious. So I like to, again, go back to the animal kingdom and point out the fact that humans are not the only species that menstruate. Primates, bats, and shrews do as well, but not all animals. And this is, again, something that we can control. Certainly with modern science, you can adjust your hormone doses by taking a hormonal contraceptive in one form or another. But a lot of women like getting a menstrual cycle every month because it's confirmation that everything's working, they're not pregnant, they're in good energy balance. But it really is an expensive process to rebuild the uterus every single month. And we're risking iron loss. Certainly the menstrual cramps are uncomfortable. And, this age-old, I kind of chuckle when I say this, that the blood will attract predators. Okay, so those are some, cons. The last one's a little bit silly. But the menstruation is good theories. If we think about the uterus really as, and the vagina as kind of a self-cleaning oven, this is really going to flush out and kind of create one-way directional flow to rinse out any bacteria, any viruses, anything we've contracted from, a sexual partner that was passing something on to us. But it's not perfect because women still get STDs, so it's not really 100% effective here. Like I said, it's not an energy saver. This is expensive to rebuild a tissue every month. It would be more efficient just to keep the same uterine lining. One thought is using it as an embryo screening process. So like I said, at about day 21, that's the day that you actually get pregnant, but the clinicians and those going on to practice medically, they don't actually recognize pregnancy until the week after your period. So usually the clock that the biologist uses, like me, is 2 weeks off from the clock that the clinician is going to use, because they want to see that you've missed your period, and then they want to get a hormone level coming from the growing embryo. So this is a way to just get rid of those embryos that had an issue with their chromosomes that aren't going to produce a viable baby, and perhaps maybe get rid of some autoimmune diseases, things like that. So the uterus might be using this as a screening device. Okay, also sperm transport. So again, keeping that cervical lining thick and kind of going through a cycle, the cervical mucus, that is. Keeping that cervical mucus thick and thin in specific windows is going to prevent sperm from entering the female reproductive tract. Some women can actually have an immune response to a male sperm. That's not going to be great for getting pregnant with that particular person. But again, keeping sperm to a minimum in the reproductive tract, only inviting them in on the 3 to 5 days that pregnancy can occur, is often a good strategy. And I've already mentioned, a lot of women like getting menses every month because it's the, hey, I'm not pregnant and everything's working sign that just lets you know that everything is good. Okay, that's it for today.